Good
Good
morning,
morning,
y'all.
y'all.
This morning's scripture comes from the 13th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew, verses 33 through 35. Jesus offered them still another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like the yeast a baker took and mixed in with 3 measures of flour until it was leavened all through. Jesus spoke all these things to the crowd in parables. He spoke to them in parables only, to fulfill what had been said through the prophet, I will open my mouth in parables. I will announce things hidden since the creation of the world. Ancient words from our tradition for our present day understanding.
One of the things I'm looking forward to when this time of social distancing is over is being able to say good morning and know that people will be listening to it in the morning again. But we're grateful to everybody who's made the effort to be here for our streaming service, but also if you're watching it during the week. Thank you so much for making time for the community. I thought what might be a good conversation today is to think about how hard it is right now in terms of waiting. And we're going to be meeting after church to talk about like how to get back together again. And it's hopeful. Doors are opening up. At the same time, it's still going to be a long time. It, maybe months. If there's a relapse, if there's a new strand or something. So I think an important conversation to have is not just in this situation, but in life as a whole. How do we use those times of waiting? Because those are the hardest times to be happy, the hardest times to be peaceful, to really enjoy the day that is in front of us when we're waiting for a medical verdict to come in, when we're waiting for something like this, really hard time of isolation and separation to finally come to an end. Can we still enjoy the bridge that we have to cross to get back to what we hope will be something sort of like normal? And we're using the parables. We're still in the series on parables. Parables are ways that Jesus tried to illustrate the deep dynamics of life. The punchline of a parable, if Jesus is telling it, is usually this is what the way of heaven is like. This is what the kingdom of God, it can be called. And Jesus is trying to teach us to perceive things that are happening already in our world. I think the church made a mistake to think of heaven as a place you have to die to get to, because what Jesus is really talking about is the way of life, the way of love, the path that is before us, how to live in wisdom and joy and peace, even as we're going through hard times. And the image Jesus gives us today in this parable is of a woman baking bread. And I think that's a pretty good image for times like this, because when you first start off making bread, it's sticky and lumpy. And there's often a time when you think there's no way this is ever going to be edible. And I think that's a situation a lot of times in life. So Jesus is saying that there is some kind of, he calls it yeast, but there's some kind of an organizing principle in life, and it pulls things together. And whether it's galaxies or species, that there's a deeper wisdom that holds the universe together that we sometimes forget. And we look at life just politically. We look at the situation just in terms of power and how do we get in control, or in terms of science, how do we understand things and find certainty? But most of life is in between times. And really, it's all in between times. There's never a finish line, as we saw last week. There's never a happy ever after. We have to love the path that we're walking through life. So Jesus says it's kind of like making bread in that there's a hidden agent in the dough that brings it to life. Yeast was a symbol of bringing things to life. Taoism has a similar concept. The Tao means a way, a path, a pattern of things. And in Taoism, they say, look, the way cannot be seen. Listen, the way cannot be heard. Reach, the way cannot be grasped. And Jesus seems to be talking about something like that, that's at work, hidden within our lives. We know some things, but we can't ever know everything. And there's a heart of mystery to the universe that we can never pierce. We can trust, but we can't understand it. So in our story today, Matthew tells us that Jesus told parables to reveal things that have been hidden since creation. And I think what that's saying is there's a mysterious intelligence and a mysterious source that pulls things together. It'll be real simple if it just turns out to be a God, but it may be something more profound and mysterious and complicated. It may be a process. It may be a sort of patterning nature to things, but that doesn't really matter. What's important is that we be in tune with it, because when that happens, when we tune our hearts to life, then even times of change can have potential for happiness and joy. So Jesus in the parables is talking about a way, a process, a path. And he's saying that after you found what brings you to life, the yeast is this life quickening agent. A lot of times we forget to choose that life, the zest, the joy, the peace, and we just try to plunge into life and fight our way through it or just endure it. And Howard Thurman, I was trying to remember who that was, the great preacher, theologian, said, don't ask what the world needs. Ask what makes you come to life and go do it. Because what the world needs is people who have come alive. Howard Thurman was a great inspiration for Martin Luther King. And so we want to list those words again, because Martin Luther King didn't dodge the justice issues, but he had something deeper. He had a deeper sense of roots so that he didn't get lost in the battle or the struggle. Howard Thurman said, don't ask what the world needs. Ask what makes you come alive and go do it. Because what the world needs is people who have come alive. So the first part of the parable is saying there's this hidden enlivening something within life. In bread, that's the yeast. In plants, it's the DNA, the seed. There's something deeper, something more profound that brings us to life. And if we're going to change things in a nonviolent way, then it has to be done organically. And so the change is going to take time. It has to grow organically. And that's the part that really frustrates us. After you've kneaded the bread, you have to have a kind of a trust in this process. And that can be very, very hard to realize that when there's nothing you can do to get in control of your life, who you are can be the most important thing, not what you do, but who you are. A person of virtue, a person of principles, and to not throw those away. That's so important. When you look around you and you see madness, you see cruelty, violence, selfishness, you see dishonesty. That commitment not to throw away your own peace of mind because everybody else seems to have lost their peace, not to throw away your wisdom because it seems like so many people have thrown away wisdom, not to throw away your virtue or your peace or your joy, that these are treasures that can work within you, even at times when they're not visible, when you can't see them at work. Like yeast, they're still growing. I mentioned Taoism. This is a Chinese religion, and it's a nature religion. So I find it very helpful in trying to understand how our ordinary experience can illustrate these things. And there was a thing in Taoism called Wu Wei. It's a Chinese word. It sometimes translated not doing, but it means more like not resisting, not fighting. It's cooperating with the life process. If you're at the beach, you realize sometimes the tides are going out, sometimes the tides are going in. And there's a kind of a skill set, a kind of art to getting through frustrating times. Before a dolphin can leap out of water, it has to go down. Before it can go up, it has to go down to use the buoyancy of the ocean in its efforts. It's in tune with nature. That's what gives it the ability to leap. It's also when you go sailing, it's like realizing you can go anywhere in the lake, but you've got to go with the wind and the current. Jesus is saying there are currents in life, and we need to tune ourselves to that. Paul talked about this same kind of thing. He used a Stoic word, macrothumia. Hupomone. Sometimes the macrothumia is a different word that's used to translate patience, but hupomone is sometimes translated patience, but it's a conquering patience. It's something that when a runner slows down and paces themselves to win a race, when a soldier gets under the shield as the arrows are coming down. In the Greek world, that was hupomone. It's a patience, but it's a kind of a conquering patience. We talked about Chris Christopherson in class today, and I thought this quote would fit here. If I can find it. There it is. Chris Christopherson was in boxing for a while. He wound up being a songwriter, but he said, "Never give up, which is the lesson I learned from boxing. As soon as you learn to never give up, you have to learn the power and the wisdom of unconditional surrender. And that one doesn't cancel out the other. They just exist as contradictions. The wisdom of it comes as you get older. Sometimes you have to slow down to get ahead. Sometimes you have to rest. So this, what Paul called patience, what Jesus is talking about yeast, what the Taoists call this path, this way that undergirds things. It's that nap you take when you've got a deadline, but you know your mind needs to be refreshed. It's taking off time, taking care of yourself, stepping back from the struggle when you're coming from a place of anger. Dr. King always interviewed people before events and asked them to step back if they were too angry, because he knew that America didn't want to hear this message and would use any kind of outbreak at all as an excuse for denying the rights that they were seeking. So this is a wisdom that applies in so many different ways. And then Jesus promises that the yeast ultimately leavens the whole loaf. That when you remember your humanity, when you remember your kindness, when you remember your wisdom, when you come from the Tao or the kingdom or this pattern in things, the way of life, the way of love. When your heart is tuned to that, other people hear that beauty and start remembering their own heart. If you've ever been with a very wise and loving person, you may be very angry, throwing a tantrum, but their response takes you to a deeper wisdom within yourself. That's what Jesus is saying, that even when you're surrounded by cruelty, by madness, by lies, by not reacting to that, by coming from your creative center, you're a leavening agent for the whole world. So the early church wasn't talking about saving people from hell and lifting up to heaven as a kind of big escape hatch. escape hatch. What Jesus was doing was trying to make it on earth as it is in heaven, tuning our hearts to this universal love. And he believed that would change everything. That religion is not just a private affair. Our lives are intertwined. We may not want to get political, but we affect each other's lives. We have to think about what our decisions mean, what our words mean, how we hurt each other without even meaning to, and how we can seek a common scale. So Jesus is talking about something that transforms the world, but it begins with your own heart. When you listen to that and come from the place of truth and love, it changes everything. I've always loved another quote. I had so many quotes this week that I didn't have time to use. But another quote that I love and use from time to time is one by Robert Kennedy that I'm sure you've probably heard, but I think it's one we can hear over and over again. He said, each time a person stands up for an ideal or acts to improve the lot of others or strikes out against an injustice, they send forth a tiny ripple of hope, and crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring. These ripples build a current that can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. So it saves the world, but first it needs to save our own heart from ignorance and cruelty. Kurt Vonnegut writes very humorous science fiction things. I don't know if he's still alive or not. But he had a fictional character he called Kilgore Trout, who was a kind of unsuccessful science fiction writer within his own science fiction story. So it may have been sort of an act of humility to have this character in there. But he says, Kilgore Trout once wrote a short story, which was a dialogue between two pieces of yeast, which may give you an idea why his books didn't sell. A dialogue between two pieces of yeast. They were discussing the possible purposes of life as they ate sugar and suffocated in their own waste. Because of their limited intelligence, they never came close to guessing that what they were making was champagne. Part of what Jesus is saying is we can get so stuck in our personal situations that we don't realize that something beautiful is being born in our common life. If we remember to listen for that something that brings us to life in our own heart, if we're willing to wait, there's a saying in Taoism that says everything happens at the only possible time it can happen, and it is always at exactly the right time. In the West, we hear that as determinism, but I don't think that's what it's saying. It's saying that if you don't harmonize yourself to nature, you're the one that will suffer and cause suffering. The timing of life is the only timing that we have. The balance of nature is the only balance we have. So again, everything that happens at the only possible time it can happen. And it is always at exactly the right time. When our hearts are at peace with that, they begin to leaven what is around us. When we remember our own deep, mysterious, loving heart, it's funny how other people start kind of remembering theirs. So Jesus wanted to teach that the sacred enters our lives in a lot of mysterious ways, but one of them is like yeast, and it's like bread. It starts off sticky, lumpy, uncooperative, and you think there's no way this is going to be bread. But the wisdom inside us and the wisdom around us and the wisdom in others communicates with itself. And ultimately, Howard Thurman is actually absolutely right that when we want to change the world, we don't start with a sense of duty or obligation. Instead, he says, and I'll close with this, don't ask what the world needs. Ask what makes you come alive and go do it. Because what the world needs is people who have come alive. So that's my understanding of our parable today. We'll take a minute for you to think about how you would capture that. So a moment for your own thoughts.
We aren't using our bell this morning, but I'll time a minute